The room is cold. I ask them to keep it cold. My people do not function well in warmth, and if I am going to talk about any of this, I need to be thinking clearly. My name is Grex Vihau. I served 22 years in the Interstellar Coalition. Ground forces. I have fought on 11 worlds. I have seen things that do not translate well into any language I know. And I have been asked many times now to talk about the humans. I always say no. Today I said yes because the journalist sitting across from me is young. She has the kind of eyes that still believe the galaxy makes sense. I want her to understand something before the belief fades on its own. The humans did not save the galaxy. That is not what this is about. They did not arrive on beams of light and solve everything. What they did was something quieter and far more difficult to explain. They showed up, they stayed, and they changed every single assumption I had built my career on. Let me start at the beginning. I first heard about human soldiers the same way most coalition officers did. Data file 3 pages, the summary described them as a mid-tier biological species from a single planet system. Average size, average strength limited. Sensory range, no natural armor, no venom, no biological advantages of note. The file recommended using them in logistics, communication support, and secondary defensive positions. I read the file, I put it down, I moved on. 6 weeks later, I was assigned to joint operations on the outer edge of the Karath system. My unit, 43 Coalition soldiers from 4 different species, would be working alongside a human squad. Designated Bravo Company, 9th Regiment. 14 soldiers. The briefing officer told us to expect a standard integration period of 2 to 3 weeks before the humans would be ready for active deployment. The humans arrived on a Thursday. By Friday morning, they had already reorganized the supply storage, identified a structural weakness in our forward shelter that 3 of our engineers had missed, and one of them had fixed a communication relay that had been intermittently failing for 11 days. No one had asked them to do any of this. I noticed them the way you notice something that does not fit the pattern. Not with alarm, not yet. Just a quiet sense that the data file had been wrong about something, and I was not yet sure what. The human squad leader was a woman named Captain Laura Graves. She was shorter than me by a significant margin, which meant almost nothing in a combat context, but still registered as unexpected. She walked like someone who had decided before leaving her quarters that the day was not going to beat her. She introduced herself with a handshake, which is a human contact greeting, and looked me directly in both of my upper eyes, which most species avoid because they find it uncomfortable. She did not look uncomfortable. She looked interested. I asked her how long her unit had been deployed in active combat zones. She thought about it for a moment, tilted her head slightly, and said, "Altogether, most of us have been rotating for about 3 years, Corporal. Owen just came back from leave, so he is a bit rusty. 3 years of continuous rotation. In our forces, soldiers rotated out after 8 months for mandatory psychological evaluation and recovery." I made a note of it and said nothing. The pre-mission ritual was what truly unsettled me. 2 days after arrival, Bravo Company was assigned to a forward observation run, low risk as missions in that Theater went. They would advance to a ridge position, hold for 6 hours, and report enemy movement before pulling back. I was observing from the operations post when the humans gathered to prepare. What I expected was what I had seen from every other unit in the coalition. Quiet preparation, systematic equipment, checks, a controlled focused silence. That signals a soldier moving their mind into the correct operational state. What I saw was something I did not have a category for. They were loud, not aggressive loud, not panic loud. They were laughing. One of them, a tall young man named Private Eli Cross, was doing an impression of something, and the others were responding with sounds I later learned were called groans and appreciative chuckles. Another soldier, a woman named Corporal Nina Holt, was eating a ration pack with the kind of focused enthusiasm normally reserved for celebrations. 2 others were having an argument about whether a particular location back on their home planet had good food. The argument sounded completely genuine and only slightly irritated. They were 40 minutes from entering a zone where enemy contact was possible. I turned to my second in command, a veteran named Drevko, and said quietly, "Something is wrong with them." Drevko watched them for a moment. "They seem content," he said. "That is what is wrong," I said. "In my culture and in most coalition cultures, laughter before a mission is not a sign of confidence, it is a sign of instability. A soldier who can laugh when their life is at risk has either not fully understood the risk or has stopped valuing their own survival." Neither interpretation was reassuring. I watched Captain Graves move through the group. She was not stopping the laughter, she was participating in it. She said something to Private Cross that made him stand up straighter, smiling. And then she tapped him once on the arm, the way someone taps a surface to confirm it is solid. She was checking on them, but she was doing it inside the laughter, not instead of it. I did not understand it. They departed on schedule, all of them. Came back 6 hours later, exactly as ordered, with complete and accurate observation data and what appeared to be a new inside joke about something that had happened at the ridge. Cross had a minor cut on his forearm from loose rock. Holt had apparently solved a secondary puzzle in her personal communication device while maintaining watch. Their mission report was flawless. I read it twice. That evening I sent a message to a colleague in the coalition's cross-species integration office. I asked him, as neutrally as I could, manage whether the human soldiers' psychological state had been evaluated before deployment. He wrote back the next morning. His response was 4 words. "They are always like that." I sat with those 4 words for a long time. I had fought in 11 conflicts. I had served alongside species that communicated through color shifts, species that had no individual identity outside of a shared hive signal, species that experienced time differently from the way I did. I had adapted to all of it. The galaxy is large and strange, and a career soldier learns to accept strangeness as a basic condition of the work. But this was different. This was not strangeness in a form I could file away and move past. This was strangeness that sat right next to the thing I thought I understood best, which was war, and made me realize I did not understand it as well as I thought. They were not unafraid. I learned that later. Corporal Holt told me months into the deployment that every single One of them was afraid before every single mission. She said it simply, without drama, the way you would describe the weather. So what do you do with it? I asked. She looked at me with an expression I had learned to recognize as mild surprise at a question she had never considered needed asking. We put it somewhere else for a while, she said. We come back to it later when there is time. I thought about that for a long time. Afterward, putting fear somewhere else. Filing it, returning to it when the conditions permitted. I had never heard a soldier describe emotional processing as a scheduling decision, but that was what it was. They were not ignoring the fear, they were managing it the way you manage a task that cannot be completed in the current moment, and they were doing it collectively together so that no one had to carry it alone. The laughter, I eventually understood, was not absence of feeling. It was a tool. It was how they kept each other inside the present moment instead of falling forward into what might happen or backward into what had already happened. It was, in its own way, one of the most sophisticated psychological survival mechanisms I had ever encountered, and I had not recognized it because it looked like joy. That was the first lesson. It would not be the last. At the end of our first week together, I updated my assessment of Bravo Company in the coalition's joint operations record, where the standard template had a field for expected combat effectiveness. I left it blank for a full day before writing anything. When I finally wrote something, I wrote, "This assessment pending, current data insufficient for standard evaluation. Parameters, recommend observation. Continue." What I meant but did not write, because I did not yet have the words for it, was this: these soldiers do not fit any model I have. I do not know what they are capable of. I am not sure anyone does. I was right, and I was about to find out exactly how right. Captain Graves found me after dinner. That evening, she sat down across from me with 2 cups of something hot, pushed one toward me and said, "You have been watching us a lot." "I watch all units under joint operation," I said. She nodded. She was not arguing, she was just nodding it. "What do you think so far?" she asked. I considered the honest answer. I considered the diplomatic answer. I chose something in between. "I think," I said carefully, "that your unit is not what I expected." She smiled. It was a small, tired smile, the kind that knows more than it is showing. "Nobody expects us," she said. "That is usually fine." She picked up her cup and drank. Outside the shelter, the wind moved across the ridge in long, slow waves. Somewhere in the direction of the forward post, light was blinking in a pattern that meant all clear. I did not sleep well that night. I was already starting to understand, in the way that precedes understanding fully, that the data file had not been wrong about the humans the way files are sometimes wrong about numbers or locations. It had been wrong about them the way description of fire is wrong if all it tells you is the temperature. There is the temperature, and then there is what the fire does. I had only seen the temperature. The real education had not yet started. The siege began on a morning when the sky over Sector 7, Kareth, was the color of a bruise. I know that is a human comparison. I have been using them for years now. They are accurate in a way that technical descriptions are not, and accuracy matters when you're trying to explain something that technical descriptions have already failed to capture. The enemy formation, a Kalvathi advance battalion of roughly 200 soldiers, supported by 4 heavy mobile platforms, had been pushing steadily through the sector for 6 days. Our combined coalition and human forces had been slowing them, redirecting them, wearing down their momentum without committing to a full engagement. It was the kind of slow, exhausting defensive work that does not appear in the stories anyone tells afterward, but it is where most wars are actually decided. By day 7, the situation had shifted. The Kalvathi had changed their approach. Instead of advancing in formation, they began fragmenting into smaller units, moving through ruins and debris fields, making themselves harder to track and harder to contain. Our sensor coverage was incomplete. The terrain was against us, and command had ordered a general rest period for all coalition forces after 6 days of continuous activity. All coalition forces. Bravo Company was not coalition forces. They were human forces attached to our command structure, which meant the rest order applied to them in theory. Captain Laura Graves acknowledged the order, confirmed receipt, and then held a 10-minute meeting with her unit that I was not invited to, but could partially hear through the operations shelter. When the meeting ended, Private Eli Cross came to find me. He was carrying 2 ration packs and a portable sensor relay that someone had modified in a way I did not immediately recognize. Captain says we are going to maintain watch on the forward position during the rest period, he said. She thought you should know, since it is technically your sector. I looked at him. He was 23 years old. He had a cut from the previous week's patrol that had not entirely healed. He looked like he had slept perhaps 4 hours in the last 2 days. The rest order applies to all attached units, I said. Yes, sir, he said. He did not move. I understood then that he was informing me, not asking permission. The captain had made a decision. Cross was delivering the information as a courtesy. And GT snorts. And GT. The decision itself was not under discussion. I could have enforced the order. I considered it for exactly the amount of time it takes to consider something you already know the answer to. Then I said, keep your communication lines open and report any contact immediately. Cross nodded, handed me one of the ration packs for a reason I still cannot fully explain, and walked out. What followed over the next 38 hours is the event that I have been asked about more than any other single incident in my entire military career. I have given formal testimony about it. Twice I have been asked to describe it at coalition training academies on 4 occasions. Every time I find that the words I prepared are not quite sufficient, and I end up saying something slightly different than I planned. Let me try to say it right this time. The Kalvathi probing advance began about 4 hours into the rest period, which suggested they had been monitoring our activity levels and timed their move deliberately. A smaller force, perhaps 40 soldiers, with 2 light mobile platforms, pushed toward the forward position that Bravo Company was holding. This was not the large-scale assault that would come later. This was a test. The Kalvathi were checking whether the position was defended. Bravo Company answered the question clearly. I was monitoring from the operations post when the first contact report came. Through Captain Graves' voice on the channel was steady, informational, almost conversational. She reported the contact, gave numbers and approach vector, and said they were engaging. She did not request support. She did not report her unit's condition. She reported the tactical situation and then went silent because she was busy. Over the next 2 hours, using terrain, debris, disciplined positioning, and a level of coordination that I found difficult to track even with sensor data. In front of me, the 14 soldiers of Bravo Company stopped the probing advance completely. The Calvathi pulled back to reassess. This was when the main force began to move. I woke my commanding officer. He looked at the sensor data and said quietly that we needed to get our forces ready. I told him that Bravo Company had already been engaged for 2 hours and was still holding the forward position. He was quiet for a moment. How many of them are down? He asked. None reported, I said. Another silence. Get them out of there, he said. We will reform the line further back. I got on the channel to Captain Graves. I told her the situation. I told her that command was pulling back, that the main force was moving, and that she needed to withdraw her unit to the secondary defensive line. She came back on the channel almost immediately. Her voice had not changed. It was still steady, still clear, but what she said was not what the order required. We copy, she said. Position is still ours. Send the transports through the northern corridor while we have it open. We will hold until they are clear. I looked at the data. The transport corridor she was referring to held 3 coalition civilian evacuation ships that had been unable to move for days because the route was exposed. If Bravo Company held the forward position for even 2 more hours, those ships could move. The math by every model I had ever used said it could not be done. I have thought about what I should have said in that moment. I was the senior officer. The order was to withdraw. I should have insisted. I said, understood, transports are moving, keep the channel open. I have never apologized for that decision. What Bravo Company did over the next 4 hours was the kind of thing that gets written about in ways that make it sound planned and clean and strategic. It was not. It was improvised, adaptive, relentlessly creative problem solving under conditions that were continuously getting worse, and it worked because the people doing it refused to acknowledge the possibility that it would not work. They had the terrain. They had the debris of 2 collapsed forward structures which they used to create overlapping fields of coverage that made their actual number impossible to assess from the Calvathi side. They had the modified sensor relay that Cross had been carrying, which Corporal Nina Holt had adapted to create false movement signatures in sections of the debris field that were not actually occupied. The Calvathi, believing they were facing a larger, more distributed force, advanced more slowly and more cautiously than they otherwise would have. Every hour of caution was an hour the transports were moving. A soldier named Private Owen Patel took a hit to his leg in the 3rd hour. He kept his position. He reported the injury in the same flat tone you would use to report a supply shortage. Another soldier, Corporal Dean Marsh, moved to cover his angle without being ordered to. Neither of them mentioned it again until after the transports were clear. The transport pilots reported the Northern corridor was secure at the 4-hour mark. All 3 ships cleared the zone. 20 minutes after that, Captain Graves gave the withdrawal order. Of the 14 soldiers who had held that position, 10 came back under their own power. 3 were carried by their teammates. 1 private first class, Aiden Cole, did not come back at all. I watched them return. They did not look triumphant. They did not look broken. They looked like people who had done a job and were now thinking about what came next. There was a quietness among them that was different from the quietness before a mission. It was heavier. It was the weight of Aiden Cole's absence settling into the space where he had been. I went to Captain Graves when she came through the operations post entrance. I did not know what to say. In my culture, there are specific phrases for the loss of a soldier, formal words measured. Words that have been used for centuries because they carry the right weight. I opened my mouth to say one of them. She spoke first. "Where do you need us?" she said. Not a request, not defiance, a genuine, immediate question about where her unit could be of use. I had no answer. I stood there without an answer for long enough that she nodded once as if I had said something, and moved past me to check on Owen Patel's leg. Later I found Private Cross sitting outside the operations shelter. He was looking at nothing in particular. I sat near him, not close, and was quiet for a while. "How do you do that?" I asked. Eventually, he looked over at me. He did not ask what I meant. He knew what I meant. "You keep moving," he said. "You stop moving, the thing catches up with you. So you keep moving." He looked back at whatever he had been looking at before, a piece of debris on the ridge, a light somewhere in the distance. Nothing. "There is time later," he said quietly. "For now, you keep moving." I filed my operational report that evening. In the section for notable unit performance, I wrote more words than I had ever written in that section. In 22 years of service, my commanding officer read it and called me into his office. "You think they knew they were going to pull it off?" he asked. I thought about Graves on the channel. The steadiness of her voice, the complete absence of doubt in those 5 words. "Position is still ours." "No," I said. "I think they decided it was going to be done. Whether they could do it was a separate question." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a very fine distinction," he said. "It is the only distinction that matters," I said. "I used to think those 2 things were the same. Now I know they are not." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he stamped the report approved and sent me back to my post. I stopped using the phrase acceptable loss in my reports after that. I removed it from my vocabulary entirely. It took about 3 weeks before I stopped catching myself almost using it. Some words, once you understand what they actually mean, you cannot put them back the way they were. The battle at the bridge had changed me. I want to be honest about that because I think honesty matters more than appearing consistent. Before the bridge, I was a competent officer with a long career and a set of working assumptions about how war operated. After the bridge, I was still all of those things, but the assumptions had cracks in them. And in the days that followed, the humans kept finding those cracks. Not intentionally. That is important to understand. They were not trying to challenge me or change me. They were just being themselves. The effect they had on my thinking was entirely unintentional on their part, which I have come to believe is exactly the kind of effect that leaves the deepest impression. The aftermath of a battle has its own rhythm. Every species I had ever fought alongside moved through it in roughly the same way: withdrawal from forward positions, resupply, medical evaluation, a structured period of minimal activity, psychological processing according to species-specific protocols. The sequence was familiar and stable. It existed because soldiers need it. Even the most experienced fighter carries weight after a hard engagement, and that weight has to go somewhere, or it accumulates in ways that degrade performance and eventually the person carrying it. My unit's protocol called for 48 hours of reduced duty following the Athara engagement. I expected Bravo Company to receive something similar from their own command structure. What I observed instead was something I initially categorized as a protocol violation. Within 3 hours of returning to base, the human soldiers were active, not in a frantic, displaced way, not in the way a soldier sometimes fills empty time to avoid processing something painful. They were purposeful. Captain Graves had her unit organized into small working groups, and each group had a task. One group was reinforcing a section of the medical shelter that had taken minor structural damage during the engagement. 2 soldiers were learning a field drainage technique from a coalition support engineer who had not asked to teach anyone anything but seemed genuinely pleased to be asked. Private Cross was at the edge of the base perimeter talking to a cluster of displaced Vithani civilians, most of them elderly, who had been sheltering near the base for 3 days. He had no translation equipment. He was using hand gestures and a patience that, from a distance, looked endless. And then there was Corporal Dean Marsh. I saw him sitting beside a section of the temporary medical area that had been partitioned off for critical cases. On the other side of that partition was a Kalvathi soldier, an enemy combatant who had been separated from his unit during the engagement and had been brought in by coalition medical teams because leaving an injured combatant in the field was not something the coalition permitted, regardless of who they were fighting. Marsh was sitting on the other side of the partition. I could hear him talking, low and steady, the way someone talks when they are filling silence for the benefit of the person on the other side, not for themselves. I moved closer. I was not subtle about it. Marsh looked up, acknowledged me with a small nod, and kept talking. He cannot understand you, I said. Marsh looked at the partition. He knows someone is here, he said. That is what matters right now. I stood there for a moment and thought about that. The Kalvathi soldier on the other side of the partition was the enemy, not in an abstract sense, in a direct, specific, recent sense. 3 hours ago, soldiers from his formation had been part of the force that Bravo Company had been holding back. Aiden Cole had not come home because of that engagement. Marsh knew all of this. Why, I asked. I meant the question more broadly than just the Kalvathi soldier. I meant all of it, the working groups cross with the civilians, the structural repairs, the refusal to stop moving, to go quiet, to withdraw. Marsh thought about it. He was not a fast talker. He chose his words the way someone chooses tools, picking the right one for the specific task. People need things, he said. If you can provide the thing they need and you have the capacity to do it, you do it. The math is pretty simple. The math, I said, does not account for the cost to yourself. He looked at me with a mild expression that I had seen on other human faces when I said something they considered incomplete. Sure it does, he said. The cost to myself is that I am slightly tired. The cost to him of being alone in there is harder to quantify. I walked away from that conversation without having resolved anything I had intended to make a point about operational priorities and recovery protocols. Instead, I was carrying a question I had not arrived with. The question was this: at what point does a soldier stop being a soldier and just become a person? And why had I always assumed those two states were mutually exclusive? Over the following days, I kept watching. A private named Lucy Carver spent a morning helping a Vithani family recover possessions from a damaged structure near the base perimeter. This was not her assignment. She had requested 2 hours of personal time and used it for this. When I asked her about it later, she seemed genuinely puzzled by the question, as if she could not immediately understand why the activity required explanation. Their home was damaged, she said. They are people, their home got damaged. That was the entire explanation. She offered no more because, from her perspective, there was no more to offer. A field medic named Dr. Ivan Royal spent 4 hours performing a procedure on a coalition soldier from a different unit, a species he had never worked on before, using anatomies and guidance from our own medical team to navigate the differences. He had not been assigned to the case. The coalition medics were occupied. He sat down, asked the right questions, and did what needed to be done. I asked him afterward how he had managed the uncertainty working on a species he had no training for, with anatomical differences that could have made a misstep catastrophic. He looked at me for a moment. The alternative was not trying, he said. That was not acceptable. Not acceptable, said with no drama. Just the flat, certain statement of a man who had looked at 2 options and found one of them genuinely impossible to choose. I thought about the phrase acceptable loss again. I thought about how many times I had written it in reports, how many times I had heard it in briefings, how completely I had accepted it as a functional description of reality. The humans did not use that phrase. I had never once heard any of them use it. I had assumed that meant they had not thought carefully enough about the mathematics of large-scale conflict. I was beginning to understand that it meant something entirely different. It meant they had thought about the mathematics and refused to let the mathematics be the final word. Captain Graves found me on the 4th day after Yathora. She did not have a specific agenda. She sat down near me in the operations post with a cup of her terrible hot beverage and was quiet for a moment in the way that means someone is deciding whether to say something. You have been different since the engagement, she said. Different how? I asked. More quiet, more watching. She considered me for a moment. You have been thinking about us. It was not a question. I confirmed it. Anyway, yes. What are you working out? She asked. I was quiet for a while. Outside, Private Cross was doing something with communications equipment in the far end of the operations area, far enough away that we had a practical privacy. The base was in its early evening rhythm. Things were, for the moment, calm. I am working out, I said carefully. How you carry all of it. Graves looked at her cup. All of what? She asked, though I thought she knew. The weight, I said. Aiden Cole Owen. Patel's leg, the Calverthy soldier. The medical area, the Vithani family. The transport pilots, all of it, you. Carry all of it at the same time, and you keep functioning. I do not understand. How the weight does not stop you. Graves was quiet for long enough that I thought she might not answer. It does sometimes, she said. You do not always see it. We do not always do it in front of people. She turned her cup slowly in her hands. But the weight. You are describing all those separate things. It is not separate. It is all the same thing. We are responsible to each other, to the Vithani family, to the enemy medic in the tent, to Cole. Carrying all of them is not a burden. It is the reason. If I stopped carrying it, I would have to ask myself what I was actually doing out here. I sat with that for a long time. The reason, not the cost, the reason. I had been framing the human capacity for sustained care as something that happened despite the war, as a survival mechanism, a psychological tool, a form of resilience that allowed them to keep functioning under load. But that framing was backward. The war was not the context for the care was the context for the war. They were out here enduring what they endured because of the weight they refused to put down. The weight was not what they carried in addition to the mission. The weight was the mission. I said quietly, that is not how I was trained to think. I know, she said, and there was nothing unkind in how she said it. She was not correcting me. She was just acknowledging the distance between where I had been and where I was now, and sitting in it with me without making it a lesson. That evening I wrote a letter, not a report, a letter to a colleague back home who had worked in cross-species psychology for the Coalition for 30 years. I described what I had been observing. I tried to be precise, to avoid the language of impressions and use the language of documented behavior. I told him about Marsh at the partition wall, about Carver and the Vithani family, about the medic Dr. Royal, about Graves in the operations post. At the end of the letter I wrote, I have been trying to identify what distinguishes them, and I believe I have found it. They do not separate function from feeling. Every other species I have served with has a mechanism for that separation, a way to compartmentalize, to operate in one mode at a time. The humans do not separate, they carry both simultaneously at full capacity, indefinitely. I do not yet know whether this is a strength, a vulnerability, or something for which we have no existing category. My colleague wrote back 3 days later. His response was one sentence. Perhaps it is simply what people look like when they decide that nothing is acceptable to lose. I read that sentence many times. I still have the message. I have read it more times than I can count. There is a thing that happens after enough time in a war where you stop seeing the individuals and start seeing the mathematics, the units, the positions, the acceptable tolerances. I had been in it long enough that the shift had happened without my noticing it. I had stopped seeing the individuals. The humans had not made that shift. I watched them for months and never once saw them make it. Every person, enemy and ally and civilian alike, remained a person to them. The mathematics was something they knew, but did not serve. I'm not saying they were not soldiers. They were exceptional soldiers, better by most objective measures, than any unit I had served alongside. What I am saying is that they were exceptional soldiers who had somehow retained entirely intact the capacity to be humans at the same time without compromise, without it diminishing either function. I had not known that was possible. I'm not sure I fully believe it is possible even now, having watched it with my own eyes. But I watched it, it happened, and it changed the way I understand what a person is capable of being, which is the kind of change that does not reverse itself when the war ends and you go home, and things return to something like normal. Some things you see, and then you carry. I put down the acceptable lost language. I picked up something else in its place. Something I do not have a precise word for in my own language. The closest I have found is in a human phrase I heard Captain Graves use once, standing over a field map marking positions that needed to be held. She looked at the map for a long time, and then she said, very quietly to no one in particular, everyone comes home. She knew as well as I did that it was not always possible. She had lost Cole at the bridge, she would lose others. Before the war ended, she knew the numbers. She said it anyway. She said it like a refusal, like a door held against the dark. I do not have a word for that in my language. I am still looking. The war ended on a Tuesday, I know that, because Dr. Priya Anand told me it was Tuesday when I woke up. I had not known it was Tuesday. I had not known much of anything for 11 days. A structural collapse during a late-stage operation, a kind of accident. That feels deeply wrong to describe as such, but that is what it was, had caught me on the wrong side of a falling support beam. Multiple injuries, significant internal damage, the kind of situation where the medical outcome is genuinely uncertain. For the first several days, I learned all of this from Priya. She told me plainly, without excess comfort, and without unnecessary clinical distance, which was exactly how I needed to hear it. She had been my primary physician through the recovery. When I woke up properly, the first thing I saw was the ceiling of the medical unit. The second thing I saw was Priya in a chair beside the recovery pod, holding a small reading device, clearly in the middle of something, and equally clearly exhausted. "You have been there all night," I said. My voice was rough. She looked up. She seemed neither startled nor particularly surprised that I was awake. "Most of it," she said. She set the device down. "Why?" I asked. She tilted her head the way humans do when they are giving a question more thought than the question seems to require. "I wanted to be here when you came around," she said. There it was, simple, insufficient as an explanation by every rational measure I possessed, and yet delivered with the absolute confidence of someone who had never considered that an alternative was needed. I did not know Dr. Priya Anand well. I knew her by function. I had seen her in the medical unit. I had exchanged the brief and practical communications that happened between a soldier and the medical staff attached to their operation. We did not share a unit. We had not served together in any of the significant engagements. She was not my kin. She was not from my culture or my species or anything in my sphere of personal obligation. She had stayed because she wanted me to wake up with someone present. I am going to try to explain what that felt like, and I'm going to fail, but I'm going to try anyway. My species processes care carefully. We extended and defined relationships with specific contexts according to mutual obligations that are established over time through shared experience. Random or unprompted care is not how we are built. It is not that we are cold. We are not cold. We form deep bonds and we maintain them faithfully, but the bonds come first. The care follows the bond. Priya had no bond with me. By every model I understood, she had no reason to be in that chair. She had stayed anyway. I asked her in the days that followed about this. I asked her about it, carefully trying not to make it sound like an accusation or like I was suggesting she had done something incorrect. I asked because I genuinely wanted to understand. You were injured, she said. Seriously, and you were alone. That combination is something I can do something about. But you did not know me, I said. I knew you enough, she said. You were here, you needed something. I had the capacity to provide it. The rest of the math did not seem relevant. The rest of the math, Dean Marsh had used almost exactly that phrase 3 years earlier, sitting outside a partition wall in a field medical area after Yathura. The cost to myself is that I am slightly tired. The cost to him of being alone is harder to quantify. They were not just similar thoughts. They were the same thought expressed by two different people in two different situations, separated by 3 years of war. It was not a coincidence. It was not a personality trait shared by two particularly unusual individuals. It was a pattern, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was not a pattern I had noticed because I had been looking for it. I had been looking for tactical patterns for performance, metrics for behavioral indicators. I had been observing the humans as soldiers. But this was not a soldier pattern. This was something underneath the soldiering. This was how they were before the uniform and after it and during it, all the way through. I spent a lot of time in that recovery pod. I had nothing to do but think, which is either a gift or a punishment, depending on the state you are in, and I found myself doing what I always do when I have too much time, going back to the beginning. First week, Bravo Company, the laughter before the mission. Captain Graves, moving through her unit, checking on them inside the laughter rather than instead of it. The bridge, Graves on the channel. Position is still ours. Marsh at the partition. He knows someone is here. Cross and the Vithani civilians there. Home got damaged. Carver with the recovery teams. They are people. Royal with the coalition patient from the other unit. The alternative was not trying. Graves in the operations post. Everyone comes home. And now Priya Anand in a chair at the end of a war because she wanted me to wake up with someone present. I had been trying to understand the humans as a collection of impressive capabilities and unusual behavioral tendencies. I had been building a file in my head, the way you build a tactical profile, looking for the explanation, the key factor, the root source. Sitting in that recovery pod with 11 days of involuntary reflection behind me, I found it. It was not a capability. It was not a tactic. It was not a psychological survival mechanism or a cultural artifact or a product of their particular evolutionary history, or rather it was all of those things, but none of those framings captured what it actually was at its center. At its center, it was a decision A decision made individually and collectively and continuously to treat every person within reach as a person, worth the effort, not because of what the person had done to earn it, not because of the relationship, not because of the calculation, because the person existed and needed something, and the decision had already been made before the situation arrived. It was pre-committed, that was the word. I kept coming back to, they had already decided. The deciding was not happening in the moment of each individual act of care. The deciding had happened earlier, at some foundational level, and what I was observing in every specific instance was just the execution of something already settled. Every species I had ever worked with made decisions constantly, efficiently, many of them better and faster decisions than I could make, but the decisions were made in response to the situation. You assess, you evaluate, you respond. The humans had made a decision that preceded every situation, a standing commitment that did not require reevaluation each time, and because it did not require reevaluation, it could not be argued down by fatigue or fear or mathematics or the scale of the loss or the identity of the person in the chair. It just was. I told Priya about this late on the last day of my recovery when she came to confirm the discharge assessment. I told her carefully, and I tried to be accurate. I wanted to explain what I had understood, and I wanted to know if I had understood it correctly. She listened to all of it. She was a good listener, quiet, attentive in the way that means the listening is real and not just waiting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. You are describing why it does not feel like a sacrifice, she said. To us, I mean. Yes, I said. That is exactly what I am describing. It is because the question was already answered, she said. Whether a person matters, that answer is always yes. So, when someone needs something, that is not a new question, it is just a situation attached to an answer we already have. I sat with that. The question was already answered. Does it ever cost you? I asked. Any of it? Does it ever become too much? She thought about it honestly, not quickly. Yes, she said, it costs. We are not unbreakable. We get tired, we grieve, we carry things that do not go away easily. The cost is real. She looked at me directly, but the cost of not doing it is higher. We know what that version feels like. We have seen it in enough places and enough people to know we do not want it. I asked Priya one more question before I was discharged. I had been thinking about how to ask it for 3 days, trying to find the right framing, trying to make sure it did not sound like the condescension it was not intended to be. Is it something you are taught? I asked. The decision, though, pre-commitment, is it passed on, trained, or is it something that happens to you through experience? She thought for a long time. Both, she said finally, and neither. We are taught that people matter. Most of us in most places grow up being taught that in some form, but teaching alone does not do it. At some point you encounter a situation. The decision has to be real, not just a thing you were told, and you either make it or you do not. She paused. People I have respected most in my life made it early, before the situations arrived, so that when the situations came, they were just living out something they had already decided. I thought about graves at the bridge. the absolute steadiness in her voice. Position is still ours, not a decision. Made in the moment, a decision made long. Before that moment, she had been living it out. I thought about Cross in the shelter. You keep moving, you stop the thing. Catches up with you, he had made his decision too, long before the bridge. Long before the 38 hours at the forward position, long before any specific test of it. I thought about Marsh at the partition. Wall, he knows someone is here. I thought about Aiden Cole, whose name I had memorized the night he did not come back, because names matter more than numbers, and I had needed to know his name. I was discharged on a Wednesday. The war had been over for 12 days. The coalition was in the early stages of the long, complicated work of rebuilding, negotiating, accounting, and trying to determine what shape things would take. When the smoke finished clearing, I was walking through the main corridor of the medical facility toward the exit, when I heard someone call my name. I turned around. Captain Laura Graves was standing in the corridor. She looked different, out of operational gear, less armored looking, more ordinary. But the way she stood was exactly the same, like someone who had decided before leaving her quarters that the day was not going to beat her. She had a cup of her terrible hot beverage. She held it out toward me. Heard you were being discharged today, she said. Thought I would walk you out. I looked at the cup. I looked at her. I thought about everything I had been turning over in my head for 11 days in that recovery room. You did not have to do that, I said. She smiled, the small, tired smile that knows more than it shows. I know, she said. We walked out together into the light of the morning, which on that planet at that time of year was long and clear, and had a particular quality that made everything look more permanent than it was. We talked about small things, where she was being reassigned, what I was planning to do with the leave time I had accumulated. She told me Cross had been promoted. I told her I was not surprised. At the edge of the facility grounds, we stopped. She had a transport waiting. I had a longer walk ahead. Grex v. Hal, she said. I looked at her. You asked me back in the first week how we carry all of it. She looked at me steadily. I never gave you a full answer. You gave me a good one, I said. Here is the rest of it, she said. You carry it because the alternative is putting it down, and once you put it down, you have to pretend it was not yours to carry in the first place, and that pretending changes you in a way you cannot take back. She looked at the transport, then back at me. Do not put it down, she said. Whatever you are carrying now, do not put it down. She walked to the transport. The door closed. It moved away. I stood there for a while. The morning light was still doing that thing with the permanence. I have been asked many times if I am afraid of humans. It is always phrased as if the answer will be yes, as if the stories I tell are meant to produce particular conclusion about danger and power and what humanity represents as a force in the galaxy. The journalist sitting across from me right now, the young one with the eyes that still believe things make sense. She has been building to that question for the last 3 hours. I am going to give her the honest answer. No, I am not afraid of humans. What I feel when I think about them is something more like the feeling you get when you realize that a limit you accepted as fixed is not actually a limit at all. When you discover that a ceiling you have been living under was not a ceiling but just a level you had not thought to go beyond. They showed me what people can be when the pre-commitment is real, when the deciding has already been done, and what remains is simply living it out, when you do not wait to determine whether someone deserves the effort before you offer the effort, when the cost is acknowledged and accepted and folded into the decision rather than used to limit it. I am not afraid of that. I want to be capable of it. I have been working on it since the morning Laura Graves walked me out of the medical facility and told me not to put it down. Some days I manage it better than others, but the deciding has been done. The journalist asks me finally the question she has been building toward. Would I fight alongside humans again? I stand up. My old injury does not bother me the way it used to, but I am aware of it. I'm aware of it the way you are aware of something that taught you something important. I would fight for them, I say. There is a difference. She asks me what the difference is. I think about the bridge. I think about Priya in the chair. I think about Graves on the transport driving away in the morning light. Fighting alongside someone means they are useful to your purpose, I say. Fighting for someone means they are the purpose. She writes something down. I put on my coat. Outside the city moves in its ordinary way, people going from one place to another with their ordinary intentions and their unremarkable days, every one of them carrying something. The deciding, I have come to believe, is the most important thing. More than the strength, more than the endurance, more than the creativity and the improvisation and the refusal to accept the mathematics as the final word. The deciding. I made mine at a bridge in an operations post, in a chair beside a recovery pod on a morning with long, clear light. I am still living it out. That is enough. For now, that is enough.